I never really thought of these events much. But lately, ever since I started this podcast where I try to decipher all of my childhood traumas, I've been stricken with nightmares and flashes of memories and just filled with so much anxiety and questions. I feel like I was focused on the wrong details. I went back to my mom's house and went through everything. I went through all my childhood schoolwork and my old yearbooks. I was looking for something that would fathom some type of importance. I couldn't find anything. But I'll keep looking. There was one thing my mom told me about. She did remind me of the old maps my friend Josh and I used to make. Most old cities and neighborhoods weren't planned really with much thought of the population. It's not really accommodating to exponential growth. The layout of roads is generally in response to geographical restrictions versus necessity. Once the connecting roads are established, new businesses and roads are positioned strategically along the existing skeleton. And eventually the paths are carved into the earth and are immortalized in the asphalt, leaving room only for minor modifications, additions, and alterations, but never any real dramatic change. My childhood neighborhood must have been so old. If straight lines moved as if crows fly, then my neighborhood must have been built based off the travelings of a snake. The first houses built must have been placed around the lake, and gradually the inhabitable area increased as new extensions were built on the original path. But these new extensions are all ended abruptly at one point or another. There was only one entrant and one exit for the entire neighborhood. Many of these extensions were limited by the lake. An aerial view of my neighborhood would give the impression that an enormous squid had once died in the woods, and some venturing entrepreneur found the corpse and paved roads over its tentacles. From my porch, you could see the old houses that surrounded the lake, but the house of Mrs. Maggie was always my favorite. She was, at best, as I could remember, around her 80s, but despite that, she was one of the most friendliest people that I have ever met. She had a head of loose white curls, always wore light dresses with floral patterns. She would talk to me and my friend Josh from the back of her porch. She would always invite us in for snacks when we were swimming in the lake. She said she was lonely because her husband Tom was always out on business, but Josh and I always declined her invitation. Mrs. Maggie was nice, but there was something a bit odd about her. Every now and then, when we would swim, she would say, "Chris, John, you're welcome here anytime." And we could hear her still yelling that when we were walking back into my house. Mrs. Maggie, like many elder homeowners, had various necessities. One of her most impressive, I think, was her sprinkler system. It was always on a timer. Though at some point, Over the years, her timer must have been broken because the sprinklers would come on at various points of the day, and often a lot of times at night. While it never really got cold enough to snow very much, several times each winter I would go outside in the mornings and Mrs. Maggie's yard would be transformed into an Arctic paradise by the frozen water. Every other yard stood sterilized and dried by the biting frost of the winter cold, but right in the middle of the bleak reminder of the savagery of the seasons was an oasis of beautiful icicles hanging from every branch, off of every leaf, off of every bush. As the sun rose, it would reflect into each piece, splintering into a rainbow. Even as a child, I was struck by how beautiful it was, and often Josh and I would go over there and walk in through the icy grass. We would have sword fights with the icicles. I always asked my mom why she left her sprinklers on during the winter. My mom always seemed to try to search for an explanation. She would say, "Well, sweetie, Mrs. Maggie is sick a lot. And sometimes when she gets really sick, she gets confused. That's why she messes up yours and Josh's names sometimes. She doesn't mean to, but sometimes she just can't remember. She lives in that big house all by herself. So it is okay for you to talk to her when you're swimming in the lake. But remember, when she invites you in, you keep saying no, okay? And you better be polite. We don't want to be hurting her feelings now, do we? But she'll be less lonely when her husband comes back, right? I mean, how long is he going to be on business anyway? It seems like he's always on business." My mom seemed to struggle, and I could see that she's become very upset. Finally, she answered, "Honey, Tom's not coming home. Tom's in heaven. He died years ago. But remember, Mrs. Maggie is sick. She gets confused and she forgets. But Tom's never coming home. If someone moved back into her house, she probably would think it was Tom. But I'm sorry, sweetie. He's gone." I was only 6 when she told me that. And while I didn't completely understand it, I was still so profoundly sad for Mrs. Maggie. I know that Mrs. Maggie had Alzheimer's, and her husband Tom had 2 sons, Chris and John. The two had worked out a payment plan with the utility companies, and they paid for Mrs. Maggie's water and electricity. But my mom said they were pricks and never visited her. I don't know if something happened between them or if it was just the illness. Maybe they lived too far, but they never came around. I had no idea what they looked like, but there were times when Mrs. Maggie must have thought Josh and I looked like they did when they were kids. Or maybe her mind was so desperate to see something she recognized, she was ignoring the images transmitted into her optic nerve, and she was reliving her past for just a little bit. I realize only now how lonely she must have been. During the summer after kindergarten, before the events of the balloons, Josh and I had taken to exploring the woods near my house. as well as exploring the lake. We knew that the woods between our houses were connected, and we thought it would be neat that if the lake near my house was somehow connected to the creek around his, we would carve ourselves a path or make a map. The plan was to make 2 separate maps and combine them. We would make the map exploring the area around the creek near his house and make another one following the outflow from my lake. Originally, we were going to make 1 map, but we realized that wasn't possible since I had started drawing the map of my area so huge and he had started his own map. We kept a map from the lake that I made from my house, and we started on his. For the first couple of weeks, it went really well. We walked through the woods along the water and paused every couple of minutes to add to the map. We did not have any of the correct equipment. We didn't have a compass, but we tried to make do. We had an idea to impale the earth with sticks when we have reached the end of our venture so that we can use it as a metaphorical forest bookmark. Eventually, however, the woods became so thick near the water coming from the lake, and we were unable to proceed further. We lost interest for a while and reduced our exploration significantly. Though we weren't completely done, we started selling snow cones again. After I showed my mom all the pictures that I have taken from school and she took away my snow cone machine, our interest in the maps revitalized. We had to come up with another plan. Although I didn't understand why at the time, my mom had placed what I considered to be extremely severe restrictions on what I could and could not do, where I could go, and who with. I had to check in frequently if I was outside playing with Josh. This meant we couldn't stay in the woods for hours to continue our new path. We thought that we could just swim when we got to the cutoff in the woods, but clearly the maps wouldn't make it. So with every obstacle we hurdled ahead, we came up with a brilliant idea. We'd build a raft. Due to construction in the neighborhood, there was a large amount of scrap building materials that the company would set in the ditch to keep out of the road. We can originate a formidable ship complete with a mast and an anchor, but this quickly diminished into something a little more manageable. We set aside the wood and took several large pieces of styrofoam that were backed by a foam board. We tied them together with a rope and a kite string. We launched our vessel a little down the water from Mrs. Maggie's. She motioned for us to come back, but we interpreted it as a proper farewell. The raft was working really well, and while we behaved and spoke as if its functionality was a given, I know at least I was a little surprised. We had a fairly long tree branch we used as a paddle, but we found it easier to simply push against the land underneath the water than actually use the paddles as intended. When the water became too deep, we simply lied on our stomach and used our hands to paddle the water, which still worked. The first time we had to resort to that method of propulsion, I remember thinking that if you were to look down at us far from above, we'd look like a colossal fat man with very tiny arms trying to make its way down the river. It actually took us several trips to get the raft to the impasse patch of the woods that marked the far west. We continued doing this all through the summer and into the first grade. Josh and I were assigned 2 different groups So, since we really didn't see one another during the school day, our parents were more than willing to let us hang out all weekend. What's more, Josh's dad had taken a lengthy construction job that required him to work the weekends. And his mother was always on call, so that meant Josh could stay at my house almost every weekend if he wanted to. We should have been making excellent progress, but we finally made it into the impasse and had the opportunity to explore past it. We couldn't really find a place to dock the raft. The woods were just too thick, and the water had eroded the land to the point where nearly 2 foot of it rised over the tributary, which exposed the twisting and damp roots. We had to turn back every time and leave the raft at the same thick trees that prompted us to build it in the first place. Even worse, winter has arrived, so we couldn't justify leaving the house in our swimsuits. We were getting nowhere. We always had to come home before we're able to gain any ground. On Saturday around 7 p.m., Josh and I were playing when one of his mom's co-workers knocked on the door. Her name was Samantha, and I remember her now because I would propose to her a couple years later. My mom said that she had to go to work to fix a problem. Samantha's car was being serviced, and she needed a ride from my mom. My mom promised that it would only take 2 hours. She said under no circumstance are we to leave the house. She would call every hour and she would expect us to check in, but ended the statement prematurely when she remembered that our phone had been cut off for delinquent payments. This is why Samantha had just come unannounced. She looked me dead in the eyes as she was closing the door and said, "Stay put." This was our chance. We watched her drive down the serpentine road towards the exit, and as soon as the car rounded the last visible bend, we ran back to my room. I dumped my backpack out while Josh grabbed the map.
"Hey, do you have the flashlights?"
No, I was thinking we'd be back before dark.
"I was thinking we should just have one just in case."
My mom has one, but I don't know where she keeps it. Wait. I ran into my closet and pulled out a box from the top shelf.
"You have a flashlight in there?"
Not exactly. I opened the box and revealed 3 Roman candles that I had taken from the pile that my mother had assembled for the 4th of July the past summer. I also pulled out a lighter that I managed to sneak away from her candle collection. This would ensure that we at least had a little light if we needed it. This was a little bit before I had been given an opportunity to actually be afraid of the woods. So it wasn't really fear that motivated our search for the light source, only practicality. We threw it in our backpacks and bolted out the back door, making sure it was closed so boxes wouldn't get out. We had 1 hour and 50 minutes. We ran through the woods as fast as possible, and we made it to our raft in about 15 minutes. We had our bathing suits underneath our clothes, so we stripped off our shirts and our shorts and left them in 2 separate piles 4 feet from the edge of the water. We untied the raft from the tree, grabbed the branch, and cast it off. We tried to move rapidly to reach a point beyond the contents of our ever-expanding map. After we passed the last charted location on our map, the water began to get really deep, and eventually we could no longer touch the bottom with our tree branch. So we laid on our stomachs and paddled with our hands. It was getting darker, and as a result, it was becoming harder to distinguish the trees from one another, and we were both becoming slightly unnerved. In the interest of making good time, we paddled fast with our arms, but this caused a lot of noise and we got tired from trying to break through the surface tension of the water. During these periods, we could hear crunching of the dead leaves and snapping of fallen sticks from the woods to our right. As we slowed our pace, the rustling of the woods would cease. And we began to wonder really if it's anything at all. We didn't know what kind of animal resides in this far in the woods. Josh and I both agree we weren't trying to find out. As Josh amended the map that I was illuminating with the lighter, we were suddenly confronted with the fact that the sounds we were hearing were not imagined. Rapidly and rhythmically, we heard it seemed to be moving slightly away from us, pushing through the woods just beyond our map. It had become too dark to see. We had misjudged how long the sun would be lingering. Nervously, I called out, "Hello?" There was a brief moment of breathless tension as we lay static in the water. The silence was suddenly broken by laughter. "Hello?" "So what?" "Hello, Mr. Monster in the Woods. I know you're sneaking around, but maybe you'll answer my hello." "Hello?" I realized how stupid it was. Whatever animal it was, it wouldn't respond to me. I hadn't realized I'd said it until after I said it. But if anything, it was actually cool that we didn't get a response. Josh continued, "Hello," in his weird, soft falsetto. "Hello," I countered in my deep baritone. "Hello, mate." "Hello, beep boop, beep boop. I am a robot." "Hello." We continued to mock each other. "Hello." It was whispered and forced, as if it was powered by the last breath in a pair of deflating lungs. But it didn't sound sickly. It had come from the spot just outside the map, which now sat behind us since we had gotten off the raft. I slowly shifted to face the direction of the sound as I fumbled with one of the Roman candles. I needed to see. "What are you doing?" Josh hissed, but I already lit it. As the sparking fuse sunk into the wrapper, I held it toward the sky. I had never really shot one of these before myself. I thought it was like a flare, like in the movies. A glowing green orb rocketed out towards the stars and quickly extinguished. I lowered my arm more towards the horizon. I could remember that there were several colors, but I couldn't remember how many times one of these things would fire. A second ball of red light burst out and fizzled above the trees, but I still saw nothing. "Let's go, man," Josh pressed. "Just one more." Lowering my arm directly above the woods in front of us, another red ball was launched from the tube. It traveled straight ahead until it collided with a tree, briefly exploding with light in a much greater diameter. Still, I saw nothing. I dropped the firework in the water and watched as one of the fireballs struggled to burst freely but quickly died, suffocating by the water. As we began to paddle in the direction towards my house, we heard a loud rustling of the leaves next to us. The breaking of branches and the trampling of fallen leaves overpowered the sound of our splashing. Somebody was running. In our panic, we jolted off the raft too violently, and it felt like one of the ropes got loose. Josh, be careful! It was too late. Our raft was breaking. Before long, it had completely fallen apart. We both held onto separate pieces of styrofoam, but the pieces weren't big enough to keep us completely afloat. Our legs were dangling beneath the water. The water was so cold. Josh, quick! I yelled and pointed to the water next to him. He scrambled, but the water was too cold to move quickly, and we both watched the map float away. I'm cold, man, Josh stuttered. Let's get out of the water, dude. We approached the shore, but each time we attempted to pull ourselves up, we heard the frantic rustling, thundering towards us from the woods. Eventually, we were too cold and too weak to try anymore. Steadily, we kicked our legs and found ourselves nearing the dock site. We toppled off the debris and tried to pull it onto land, but pieces kept slipping away in the direction of the lake. We took off our swimsuits and we desperately tried to get dry. Finally, we had made it back to our clothes. I put on all my clothes and something was wrong. I turned to Josh. Where's my shirt, man? He shrugged and suggested, maybe it got knocked into the water. It floated down the lake. I told Josh to go back to my house and say we were playing hide and seek if my mom was home. I had to find my shirt. I ran behind the houses and peered out over the water and scouted over the shoreline. It occurred to me with any luck that maybe I would find the map too. I was moving pretty fast because I needed to get home. I was going to give up when my concentration was interrupted by the sound of something coming from behind me. I whipped around and it was Mrs. Maggie. I had never seen her in this light before, and in this poor light, she looked so exceedingly frail. The usual warmth that wrapped her manners seemed to be snuffed out by the cold. I couldn't even remember her with a smile. Her face looked so strange. Hello, Mrs. Maggie. Oh, hi, Chris. The warmth and smile had returned back to her face, as if a memory with her and Chris was suddenly flooding her brain. Jokingly, I asked, "Are you going to invite us in for snacks?" But she said, "Maybe another time." I didn't realize it now because I was too busy looking for my map and my shirt to really engage with her, but she sounded a little happy. So I didn't feel bad. She said a couple other things, but I was way too distracted to pay attention. I said goodnight and ran down her driveway towards my house. Behind me, I can hear her walking across the frozen yard, but I didn't turn around to wave. I had to get home. I made it home a couple minutes before my mom did, and by the time she came in, Josh and I had already changed. We had gotten away with it, even though we lost the map. Couldn't find it. No, but I saw Mrs. Maggie. She called me Chris again. I'm telling you, dude, just be glad you've never had to see her at night. It's fucking creepy. We both laughed, and he asked me if she had invited me in for snacks, jokingly. I told him, surprisingly, no. She didn't ask me in. Literally every time we see her, she's invited us in for snacks, and here I had, I guess, sarcastically invited myself in, and she said no. As Josh talked more about Mrs. Maggie, I suddenly realized that the lighter might still be in my pocket, and my ass is grass if my mom were to find it. I grabbed the shorts off the floor and patted my pockets. I felt something, but it wasn't the lighter. From my back pocket, it slid out, a folded piece of paper. My heart leapt. The map! But I watched it float away. As I unfolded the paper, my stomach turned as I tried to understand what I was seeing. Drawn on the paper inside of a large oval, there was 2 stick figures holding hands. One was much bigger than the other, and neither had faces. The paper was torn, so part of it was missing, and there was a number written near the top right corner. It was either 15 or 16. I nervously handed it to Josh and asked him why he put it in my pocket. He scoffed at the idea and asked why I looked so upset. I pointed to the smaller figure, and written next to it was my initials. I shook it off, and Emmy and Josh continued our conversation about Mrs. Maggie. I had always attributed the odd exchanges to her being sick until I revisited the events in my mind from all these years. As I think about it now, the feeling of profound sadness for Mrs. Maggie returns, but it's augmented by the looming feeling of despair. When I think about when she said, "Maybe another time." I knew what she had said, but I didn't understand what it meant that night. I didn't understand what her words had meant weeks later when I watched men in strange orange suits and biohazard bags carrying away what I thought were bags of garbage from Mrs. Maggie's house. I didn't really question why the whole neighborhood smelled like death that day. I didn't understand when they condemned the house and boarded it all up a little while after we moved. But I understand now. I understand why her last words to me were so important. Even if neither she nor I realized it at the time. Mrs. Maggie told me that night that Tom had come home. But I know now who had really moved in. Just as I know now why I never saw her body brought out on a stretcher. The bags weren't filled with garbage. The same man that was living underneath our crawl space. The same man that sent me all those pictures. The same man's footsteps that I heard every night, that I mistaken as my heartbeats. I never saw them bring Mrs. Maggie's body out on a stretcher because those orange hazard bags weren't filled with garbage.